there is a sentence more dangerous than anger, not because it is louder, not because it is more aggressive, but because it is quieter, controlled, deliberate. Anger can be explosive, chaotic, unpredictable. It rises quickly and often fades just as fast. Even harsh words spoken in anger carry a certain instability. They reveal a loss of control, a moment where emotion overrides intention. But this sentence is different. It does not come from a loss of control. It comes from control itself. It is measured, chosen, delivered with awareness, and that is what makes it cut deeper than any insult ever could. Because when someone insults you in anger, there is still a part of you that understands it was heat, it was emotion, it was temporary. You may feel hurt, but you can still separate the moment from the person. This sentence removes that separation. It forces you to confront something far more unsettling, that what happened to you was not accidental. It was decided. There is a psychological shift that happens the moment you realize this. It is subtle at first, almost like a pause in your perception. Something doesn't align anymore. The story you were telling yourself about the situation begins to crack. Maybe you thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe you believed it was a bad moment. Maybe you gave them the benefit of the doubt. But this sentence erases all of that. It replaces uncertainty with clarity. And clarity in this context is not comforting. It is cold. Because now you are no longer dealing with confusion, you are dealing with intention. And intention carries weight. It implies awareness, planning, and choice. Choice is what changes everything. Because if something is chosen, it could have been avoided. If it was deliberate, it could have been stopped. If they knew what they were doing, then they also knew what it would do to you. And they proceeded anyway. That realization does not just hurt, it restructures how you see the person entirely. It challenges every previous interaction, every memory, every moment where you believed there was mutual understanding or respect. You start to look back and question things you once accepted without hesitation. Was that really accidental? Was that truly harmless? Or was there always something underneath that you didn't fully see? This is where the sentence becomes more than just words. T becomes a lens that forces you to reevaluate reality. Because when intention is revealed, it exposes a level of psychological distance between you and the other person, one that you may not have noticed before. You were engaging from a place of assumption, perhaps even trust, while they were operating from a completely different internal framework. That gap is what creates the shock. You were experiencing the same situation but not the same meaning. And once that gap becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. There is also something uniquely destabilizing about the calmness that often accompanies this kind of statement. There is no urgency in it, no emotional overflow, just a steady, almost casual delivery. That calmness sends a message on its own. This was not difficult for me, and that message can be more painful than the words themselves, because it suggests that your emotional experience, your confusion, your hurt, your reaction was anticipated, and yet it did not matter enough to change the outcome. It places you in a position where you realize that empathy was not absent by accident. It was withheld. And when empathy is withheld consciously, the interaction changes from human to strategic, from connection to control. This is why the sentence lingers. Long after it is spoken, it continues to echo not just in your memory, but in your interpretation of everything that followed. It becomes a reference point, something your mind returns to in order to make sense of what happened. And often the most difficult part is not the sentence itself, but what it reveals about reality. Because it removes the possibility of misunderstanding. It removes the comfort of ambiguity. It leaves you with something direct, undeniable, and difficult to process. That someone saw the impact and chose it anyway. But within that realization, something else quietly begins. Awareness, not immediate strength, not instant clarity, but the beginning of it. Because once you see intention clearly, you are no longer operating blindly. You are no longer trying to fix something that was never broken by accident. You are seeing it for what it is. And while that may feel heavy at first, it also marks a turning point. Because the moment you recognize that the situation was intentional is the same moment you stop trying to explain it away. And that is where our perception begins to change. Before anything is said out loud, before any visible damage is done, something much quieter is already in motion. It doesn't look like aggression. It doesn't feel like danger. In fact, from the outside, everything can appear completely normal. But internally, a process has already begun. Not sudden, not explosive, gradual. This is where most people misunderstand harm. They imagine it as something impulsive, something that happens in the heat of the moment, a reaction, a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But intentional harm rarely works like that. It is built, thought by thought, interpretation by interpretation, moment by moment. There is a kind of silent construction happening beneath awareness, a shaping of perception that slowly alters how one person begins to see another. At the center of this process is something every human being carries, a hidden layer of the self made up of uncomfortable truths, resentment that was never expressed, jealousy that was never admitted, insecurity that was never understood, aggression that was never processed. Most people encounter these parts and instinctively pull away. They suppress them, distract them, themselves, or try to outgrow them without ever really facing them. And for a while that works. But avoidance does not eliminate these parts, it only buries them. And what is buried does not disappear, it waits. Because anything that remains unexamined begins to influence perception from the background, quietly, subtly, without announcing itself. This is where the shift begins. Instead of recognizing these inner tensions as internal, the mind starts to externalize them. Discomfort needs a source. Frustration looks for a target. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, another person becomes that target. It doesn't happen all at once. At first, it's small, a slight misinterpretation, a mild irritation that feels bigger than it should, a moment that lingers longer than necessary. Then it builds. Patterns are created where none exist. Intentions are assigned without evidence. Neutral actions begin to feel personal. The mind starts connecting dots, but the dots are being placed selectively. Only the moments that support a certain narrative are remembered clearly. The rest fade into the background, and the narrative itself becomes stronger over time. This person disrespects me. They're against me. They're the reason I feel this way. Once that narrative takes hold, it begins to feel like truth, not because it is accurate, but because it has been repeated enough times internally that it becomes familiar, and familiarity feels convincing. This is where something critical happens. The person stops questioning their interpretation. It no longer feels like a perspective. It feels like reality. And once that line is crossed, the internal world becomes self-reinforcing. Every new interaction is filtered through the same lens. Everything is interpreted in a way that strengthens the existing belief. Contradictions are ignored. Nuance disappears. Complexity is reduced to certainty. Now the other person is no longer seen as a full individual. They become simplified, defined, fixed into a role, and that role is usually negative. This is the point where emotional distance begins to form. Because when someone is reduced to a role instead of understood as a person, empathy starts to fade. It becomes easier to dismiss them, easier to blame them, easier to justify reactions toward them. But it goes deeper than that. At a certain stage, the mind begins to rehearse, not consciously, not always in a clear or deliberate way, but repeatedly. Imagined conversations, predicted arguments, internal monologues where one side is always right and the other is always wrong. In these rehearsals, the outcome is controlled. The other person doesn't get to respond authentically. They are scripted. Their words are anticipated, shaped, and responded to in advance. And in every version of these internal scenarios, the same conclusion is reached. I'm justified. This repetition matters because it removes hesitation. It removes doubt. By the time a real interaction happens, the emotional groundwork has already been laid. The decision has already been prepared. And this is why, when harm finally occurs, it doesn't feel sudden to the person causing it. It feels like the natural next step, like something that was building all along, even necessary. This is what makes it so difficult to recognize from the outside. Because while one person is experiencing confusion, trying to understand what changed, the other has already gone through an entire internal process that led them here. A process that was invisible, unspoken, but deeply inside, knowable. And this is the uncomfortable truth. By the time intention becomes visible, it has already been justified internally. The action is just the final expression of something that has been forming for a long time. Which means the real shift didn't happen in the moment of harm. It happened long before that, quietly, in the way perception was shaped and left unchallenged. At a certain point, something changes and it's not immediately visible. There's no clear moment you can point to. No obvious shift in behavior that signals what's happening underneath. From the outside, interactions may still look normal. Conversations still happen. Words are exchanged. Time moves forward, but internally the lens has already changed. Perception is no longer neutral. It becomes selective. What once felt ordinary now feels loaded with meaning. Small actions are no longer seen as they are interpreted, filtered, and reshaped into something else. A pause in conversation becomes intentional silence. A delayed response becomes disrespect. A neutral expression becomes disapproval. Nothing is taken at face value anymore. Everything is translated, and the translation is not ran. It follows a pattern that confirms what the mind has already started to believe. This is how distortion works. It doesn't create something entirely new, it reshapes what already exists until it fits a specific narrative. A narrative that feels consistent, convincing, and increasingly difficult to question. And once that narrative takes hold, it begins to organize reality around itself. Moments that support it are remembered clearly. Moments that contradict it are dismissed or forgotten. Over time, the imbalance grows. It starts to feel like proof. This always happens. They're always like this. I knew it. These statements feel certain, but they are built on a filtered version of reality. What's actually happening is quieter, but far more powerful. The mind is no longer observing. It is constructing, and construction requires repetition. This is where internal rehearsal begins to deepen. Conversations are replayed not as they happened, but as they are now understood through this distorted lens. Words are reinterpreted. Intentions are reassigned. Meaning is rewritten. The new conversations are imagined. Future scenarios are played out in advance. Here the outcome is already decided. In these imagined exchanges, one side is consistent, predictable, and justified. The other is reduced, flattened into a role, the role of the problem. And because these rehearsals happen repeatedly, they begin to feel real. Not hypothetical, not imagined, but expected, almost inevitable. This is why, when an actual interaction occurs, it often feels strangely familiar, like something that has already happened before. Because internally it has. The reaction is not spontaneous. It has been practiced. And practice removes hesitation. It removes uncertainty. It creates a sense of readiness that feels like clarity but is actually rigidity. There is no longer space for alternative interpretations. No curiosity, no pause, no reconsideration, only confirmation. This is the stage where emotional distance solidifies. Because empathy depends on flexibility, the ability to consider that another person might have a different intention, a different perspective, a different internal experience. But distortion eliminates that flexibility. It replaces it with certainty. And certainty, when built on a distorted foundation, becomes dangerous. Use it justifies. It justifies reactions that would otherwise feel excessive. It justifies conclusions that would otherwise feel premature. It justifies actions that would otherwise feel wrong. And over time, something even deeper begins to form, not just frustration, not just resentment, but contempt. Contempt is not loud. It does not need to be. It is quiet, settled, and deeply rooted. It is the belief that the other person is no longer equal, no longer deserving of understanding, no longer worthy of patience. Once contempt takes hold, the emotional barrier becomes complete. The other person is no longer seen in full. Their complexity is erased. Their humanity is reduced to a simplified negative identity. And when that happens, something critical disappears. Restraint. Because restraint depends on recognition, the recognition that the other person feels, reacts, and experiences reality just as deeply as you do. But contempt removes that recognition. It creates distance. And within that distance, actions that once felt unthinkable begin to feel possible, even reasonable. This is where the final shift occurs. The internal narrative has been built. The distorting ion has been reinforced. The emotional distance has been established. Now, the idea of causing harm no longer feels like a violation. It feels like a response to something that has been internally defined as real. And because it feels real, it feels justified. This is what makes this stage so difficult to detect from the outside. Because the person causing harm does not feel confused. They feel certain. They don't see themselves as crossing a line. They see themselves as acting in alignment with what they believe to be true. And that belief has been carefully constructed over time, not through facts, but through repetition, distortion, and unchecked interpretation. So when the moment finally comes when something is said or done that causes real damage, it does not feel sudden to them. It feels like the natural continuation of a story they have already accepted. a story where their actions make sense and where your experience was never fully considered, and then it happens, not loudly, not chaotically, but with a kind of stillness that feels almost unnatural. After everything that built beneath the surface, the interpretations, the rehearsals, the quieting, justifications, there comes a moment where it no longer stays internal. It becomes visible. Something is said, something is done, and the impact is immediate. You feel it before you fully understand it. A shift, a break, a sense that something irreversible has just occurred. At first, the mind searches for explanations. Maybe it was miscommunication. Maybe it came out wrong. Maybe there's something you're missing. Because the alternative, that it was intentional, feels too heavy to accept all at once. So your mind tries to soften it, but then comes the moment that removes all doubt. The sentence, simple, direct, uncomplicated. I knew exactly what I was doing. I meant it. I wanted you to feel it. There is no hesitation in it. No emotional overflow. No attempt to take it back. Just clarity. And that clarity does something immediate. It collapses every possible excuse your mind was holding on to. What once felt confusing becomes sharply defined. This was not a misunderstanding, not a reaction, not an accident. It was a decision. And decisions carry something that reactions do not. Responsibility. In that moment, you are no longer trying to figure out what happened. You are faced with the reality of why it happened. Because when someone says they knew what they were doing, they are telling you something precise. They were aware of the impact. They anticipated your reaction. They understood the outcome, and they chose it anyway. That realization doesn't just hurt, it reorganizes your entire perception of the situation. You begin to see everything differently. The moments leading up to it, the tone in their voice, the subtle shifts you couldn't quite explain before. It all starts to align in a way that feels unsettlingly clear. What once felt inconsistent now makes sense. Not in a comforting way, but in a revealing one. Because now you're not looking at isolated moments, you're seeing a pattern. And within that pattern, something becomes undeniable. Your experience was not incidental. It was part of the design. There is also something deeply disorienting about the calmness that often comes with this kind of admission. There is no visible struggle, no sign of inner conflict, just a steady acknowledgement. And that calmness sends a message beyond the words themselves. This did not cost me anything. While you are processing, on fusion, hurt, or disbelief, they are composed, not because they don't understand what happened, but because they do. That contrast is what creates the emotional shock. You are reacting to something that, for them, has already been settled, already accepted, already justified. And this is where the dynamic becomes clear. This is not about expression. It is about control. Because in speaking that sentence, they are not just revealing intention, they are asserting it. They are defining the situation on their terms. They are placing themselves in a position where your emotional response becomes part of their awareness, something they anticipated and accounted for. Your reaction does not interrupt the process, it confirms it. And that is what makes the moment so difficult to process, because it forces you to confront something that goes beyond the action itself, that your inner experience, your thoughts, your feelings, your response was considered from the outside, observed, and then influenced, not by accident but by choice. This is the point where many people instinctively look for something to hold on to, a sign of regret, a shift in tone, any indication that the clarity might soften into something more human. But often it doesn't, because from their perspective nothing has gone wrong. The outcome matches the expectation. And when expectation is fulfilled, there is no internal pressure to change the narrative. This is why the moment lingers, not just because of what was said, but because of what was missing. The absence of doubt, the absence of hesitation, the absence of empathy, and in that absence something becomes undeniable. You are no longer dealing with uncertainty. You are dealing with awareness, clear, deliberate, and fully owned. That realization may feel heavy, but it also removes something that was quietly keeping you stuck. Confusion. Because once intention is spoken out loud, there is nothing left to interpret, no hidden meaning to search for, no ambiguity to decode, just truth direct, unfiltered, and difficult to ignore. And while that truth may not bring comfort, it brings clarity. And clarity, even when painful, is the beginning of seeing things as they actually are. After the truth is revealed, the pattern doesn't end, it shifts. What was once admitted with clarity may now be softened, denied, or refrained, aimed. The focus moves away from what was done and onto how you react to it. You're overreacting. You misunderstood. It wasn't that serious. This creates confusion, but only if you engage with it. Because the real control no longer comes from the action itself, but from making you question what you already know. And this is where your decision matters. You don't need to convince them. You don't need their agreement. You only need to hold on to what was clear. They knew, and they said it. The moment you stop negotiating with that truth, something changes. The confusion fades. The need to explain disappears. The cycle loses its grip, because it only continues if you stay inside it. Clarity is your exit. You can step back without anger. You can walk away without closure. You can move forward without carrying what they tried to leave in you. What happened was intentional, but what you become after it, that is still yours to decide.